And thanks to YSBC for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm really glad that they also started us off with a good breakfast, so thanks to YSBC. So it's a sincere pleasure of mine to be speaking with you today about this topic of millennials because it's in the forefront of everyone's thinking nowadays. Everyone in the business world is starting to wonder, how do we deal with this new generation that's coming down the pipe? And I started to think about, how I would talk to you today about this subject. And, I've worked with a number of millennials over the years, probably hundreds of them, and I was going to come up here and talk to you about how wonderful they are, how smart they are, and all the different things that they're contributing to the workplace. And it got me thinking that, wow, I'm suddenly one of those senior management folks, and how did I become the old gal? So it's interesting because, once upon a time I was in that sort of new group coming into the workforce, and now I've had some experience and I'd like to impart some of that knowledge onto you. But I also wanted to put out there for you millennials that one day you're going to be the one up here wondering who this new Gen Z is and why don't they understand anything that you're talking about. So HR has been a passion of mine for probably about 20 years now. And what's interesting is that, through my time in the corporate world, I've had the privilege of doing a number of human capital studies, a lot of which included a focus on generational segmentation. And when I had the opportunity to become an HR consultant, I started to work with some small and mid-sized businesses and help them with their people strategy. So that's sort of become an even greater calling of mine. And if there's one thing that I hope that you take away from today, it's to think fast, think mobile, and think creatively. I guess that's probably the simplest way that I can describe to you this group of people that we're going to be speaking about today, these millennials. And those are people like Mark Zuckerberg and his social media giant, Facebook, people like Malala Yousafzai and her inspiring dedication to female education around the globe, people like Jessica Alba, who managed to build herself a fantastic e-commerce company called Honest Co. What do all these folks have in common? Well, they were, aside from being wildly famous and successful, they were all born in between the years of 1980 to 2000. So that puts them in this group of people that we've dubbed the millennials. What is the influence of millennials? Well, they're all around us, they're everywhere. They're in the businesses that we use every day. They run the companies, they practice the philosophies that we admire. They write the books and the blogs that we look at on a daily basis, and they also invent a lot of the websites that we use and the apps that we use all the time. We share in their successes and, of course, their failures, their private struggles and triumphs, and, of course, through social media, we share all of their gossip. And I'm no expert in generational psychographics, nor do I like to make broad generalities about people. But what was interesting when I was doing some of these human capital studies was that you would notice some really key differentiating unique qualities about the different groups that you were dealing with. And with millennials, a lot of that came down to specific characteristics that were common only to that generation, and you really started to see that there were significant differences between one group and another. And with the millennials, it was very clear that they were going to be changing the face of business as we knew it. And also over the next 10 years, they were going to be altering the way that we look at the workforce and what we expect from the workforce. So what are these different generations? What is generational segmentation? And how do we use it? So these are the generations that have basically been set up from different groups over the years. The years tend to change depending on who you're talking to, but that's a basic idea of what the different generations are. We start, I don't know if there's a pointer here, but we start with the baby boomers, and they're from 1945 to 1965. So they're basically now between 50 and 70 years old. These guys were born into a World War II, a post-World War II environment. So a lot of social change going on. They were influenced greatly by television. Television gave them their news and their information, and it helped to shape their culture. There was a lot of competition for baby boomers because there was such a great number of them. So in places like the education system and in the business world, a lot of competition. And so they had to work really hard to get where they wanted to be. So a lot of baby boomers are basically making up our corporate leaders today, and they're also starting to make up a large portion of our retirees. Gen Xers, they're the group between 1965 and 1980. They're between 35 and 50. And they're what I like to consider the not really forgotten middle child, but the group that's sandwiched in between the baby boomers and the Gen Xers. So they're making up 7 million, where the baby boomers and the millennials are at about 9.5. Gen Xers were introduced to fantastic improvements in technology, an introduction of pop culture, and they grew up with what was termed the latchkey experience. So the latchkey experience was basically baby boomer parents who were starting to focus on their careers, and the Gen X children were basically left to fend for themselves a lot of the time. So really independent people, this Gen X group, and that also translates into the workplace. Now eventually as kids we didn't care so much because we also saw the introduction of the mass production of the PC. So once the personal computer and things like video games came along, we were good. We were good being left to our own. So that's a basic sort of overview of who the Gen X's are. With regard to the business world, Gen X has started to see an introduction of work groups and the sort of flatter structures that we see today. Next we have the millennial group. They're between 1980 and 2000. So who here's a millennial? Anybody between 1980 and 2000? Come on, don't be shy. All right, so quite a few of you. And that's kind of indicative of how many are in the workforce today, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but millennials, you've been stereotyped as being entitled and self-centered and unmotivated, and there's a lot of question about what's your contribution going to be to the workforce today. Personally, I think millennials have gotten a bad rap. I think that millennials have a lot that we should celebrate. First of all, they grew up, or they graduated into an era of a recession, maybe one or two recessions for that matter. But they were all highly educated, highly intelligent people, and because of this recession era that they grew up in, they also had to compete and work very hard to make their dreams come true. They can multitask like no other group before them. Basically, they are able to multitask on about 3 different devices at the same time, whereas Gen X is maybe only 2, if we're lucky, and they're the most focused group on global issues up to this point, and that's probably because they've had all this access to the internet. Why should we focus on this millennial generation in particular? Why all this buzz about the millennials? Well, millennials are the group that is driving the bottom line in the business world today. And by the year 2020, they will make up 50% of the workforce. And they will also drive 30% of retail sales. Now that's huge. So they're dominating, and as more baby boomers retire, they will come to the forefront even more. So there's a clear business case for companies to change their practices and to start focusing on attracting and retaining millennials. And this, of course, is going to have a direct impact on things like recruitment activities. So that's something that we need to pay attention to, and we need to understand how to motivate these millennials to add value to our companies. How are we going to help them? Otherwise, if we're not able to do that, we're going to end up with a crucial skills shortage in the long run. Now, millennials in Canada make up approximately 37% of the workforce. They're the largest group now, the millennials. And the Gen Xers and the baby boomers are respectively about the same at about 31%. So Canada's workforce is shrinking overall, but it also means that we need to focus on this struggle to recruit and to retain, and it's getting harder. But studies have shown, and I want to point this out, studies have shown that the most effective workforce you can have is a diverse workforce. Even though we're going to focus on millennials in this talk, and a lot of companies will focus on hiring millennials, we want to make sure that you understand that a diverse workforce, one that's got a well-rounded complement of the different groups and different demographics and people from all over the place, is the one that's going to have the best opportunity to drive your business results forward. And survival demands adaptation. So the flatter hierarchy, autonomy, and the flexible structures that the millennials prefer, these are the structures that we're going to have to start thinking about and implementing. And unlike Gen Xers, unemployment was not the biggest concern for this group, the millennials. It was underemployment. So underemployment comes from the fact that they graduated into this recession environment where companies started to implement things like temp contract positions, never-ending internships. You know, it's the new way of the world to have these contract positions that just keep going on and on forever. And hopefully, if you're lucky, that will translate into a full-time position. But that type of mentality and that type of recruitment structure or hiring structure in your company ends up, over time, eroding the loyalty that millennials have to any given company. So when we talk about millennials not sticking with a company, it's because of the type of job structure that we've set up in the world today. So who are these millennials and what do they believe in? Well, they don't believe in being shackled to tradition. There's never been a time that this group has been without technology. They take for granted that you can have a bank and a library and an entertainment system and a communication device all in the palm of your hand. I guess the only thing that millennials are shackled to is probably their device and maybe the proximity to a Wi-Fi signal or a cell tower. They don't believe in the inherent value of FaceTime. So FaceTime or face-to-face communications are saved for those really important meetings, or they're saved for, or they're made into smaller meetings or shorter meetings. It's not about having these constant meetings all day long anymore. What they do instead is they believe in maximum impact from being efficient. And of course they use their technology in order to do that. So there's less meetings, but there's more email, there's more texting, there's more video conferencing, there's a lot less focus on things like traveling to work and making sure everybody's all physically in the same place at the same time. They're actually much more connected than the generations before. When we used to want to know what was going on with our friends in Gen X, we'd go to the mall. And we'd hope that somebody would show up and we'd maybe meet a few people and figure out what was going on. Well, the millennial group, they're able to do all of that right from their living room. So that's how they've been used to growing up, with their friends first, and that's also what's translating into the business world. So companies need to understand that that's how millennials communicate and start to use those tools as well. So self-worth and learning is more than just a piece of paper. I can tell you that I've had a lot of Gen X's and baby boomers talk to me about what their degrees mean to them and how they've worked hard to get these degrees and certifications and designations, and how those pieces of paper got them where they wanted to be. Or I've had people talk to me about the degrees and certifications that they didn't get, and how that's held them back from a particular project or a promotion or something like that. It's not that millennials don't value education, they do. In fact, they're more educated than any group before them. It's just sort of a minimum requirement for them. Millennials are all about learning what they need in order to get the job done. And they like to work with people who have the mindset of continuous learning without compromising their work or their family life. And millennials are very, very big on learning from other people's experiences. So learning from a DIY or a do-it-yourself perspective, that's what millennials focus on. They gobble up information from more experienced people, from anyone from formal advisors to historical figures, the internet. They're fantastic, resourceful people that are able to get information from everywhere. There aren't the sort of closed doors anymore that used to once exist, and that's why companies really need to focus on that true open door, not even open door policy, but open room policies now. A lot of the newer millennial focused sort of digital marketing internet companies that I've dealt with or who are my clients, they'll all be in one room together at different sorts of tables where it can focus on collaboration and communication and just being with people when they're at work together. So work-life balance, that was a term that was coined a while ago, but it was really just sort of a buzz phrase. It was something we liked the idea of, and the Gen X's sort of started realizing maybe we should have a little bit better work-life balance, but a lot of us didn't really practice it very much. The millennials, this is who they are. It's not just a nice idea. They really feel that it's important to have work that's fulfilling and that's integrated with the rest of their life. So their work and their family and their friends and their hobbies, everything is all working together in harmony. When you compare one generation to another in the workplace, you've got your baby boomers who are work-focused, goal-oriented, and competitive, and they're extremely loyal to their employer. They're the group that worked really hard to get where they are. They've worked long days, they've done their time, and they're extremely loyal to their employers. Gen X's, because of the way they were brought up in a more independent lifestyle, they're more individual in the workplace. So they're a little more siloed. They've started to learn technology and realize the importance of flexibility and balance. But this group had a lot of independent working, siloed working, individual project management. That's who the Gen Xers are. The millennials, they are highly tech savvy. They are born digital, they've grown up with the internet, and they're the first generation in the workplace that came into the workplace with a stronger understanding of a key business tool than any generation before them, namely the technology. So these people would come right out of school into work, and they understood all the technology that we needed to learn, and the rest of us were just starting to learn. They knew it all because they'd been doing it from the very beginning. So that was a very that was very important for millennials to to their development and to their moving up within the workplace, because they knew the technology so well, they were able to move up very quickly. And hence you get this idea that, you know, every millennial wants to be promoted within a year or two to senior manager, but a lot of that came from the fact that they knew the technology when others didn't. What they really needed was somebody to help them develop their management style, help them manage how to work in the workplace properly. They needed that other side of the piece that some of the other generations learned over the years. So they're uncomfortable with bureaucracy and communication barriers, and they value open communication and feedback and encouragement. And they want recognition, and they want to be able to develop quickly, but they also realize now that they can't develop too quickly, that they sometimes in the past have been put into those positions that they maybe weren't ready for. So companies need to have a focus on this continuous development of the millennials from the perspective of helping them move up in management. Any questions so far? Okay. So now, as we can imagine, all of these characteristics came from somewhere. There's something that helped to sort of define each generation and an influence that they had in order to develop the different characteristics that they have. Things like politics and education and the environment that they were in. So does anybody have an idea of what one of the main drivers is in defining what a specific generation becomes? Any idea? Okay, well, it's parenting style. So parents, because they significantly define the characteristics and the parenting style that people were brought up in. You know, think about what we've talked about so far and how the Gen X's who had baby boomer parents, they're characterized as more independent because they introduced more mothers to the workforce than ever before. So a lot of them were left to be on their own. And they didn't yet have the sort of widespread childcare services that we have now. So again, they were independent. And so that led to silos and entrepreneurs and individual project management. Millennials who have Gen X parents, they're subject to what we term as helicopter parenting. And that every generation is determined to give their children a better experience. So if Gen Xers grew up in an environment where they were wondering where their parents were, they turned around and started hovering over their children and making sure they were always there for their kids and they never let anything go wrong. So you know, where we might have been kids running around, we scraped our knee, we, you know, just poured some water on it and kept going. The millennials, they're sent off to every event with their itinerary and their cell phone and their first aid kit. You know, so helicopter parenting is how we define the main influence over millennials, and that's how they've adapted to the business world. And that's why they've become so collaborative. That's why they need access to the higher ups, unlike any generation before. It's because that's what they had with their parents. Parents started to include kids in their purchasing decisions, which hadn't happened before. It was what kind of vacation do you want to go on? What kind of sport do you want to do? You know, what kind of pants should we buy for you? That kind of thing. So they've been used to being included in high-level decision making, and that's been translated into the workforce. And that's why they're natural networkers, and they use their technology, and they also want access to your business leaders. They want access to the strategic thinkers in your company because that's what they've been used to. So you might think that the characteristics of any given generation, or the millennials in particular, are going to change as people age. But studies have shown that it doesn't really change. Their priorities may change as they grow and they have children and move up in the workforce, but their basic characteristics don't change. So you can't expect to keep the same style of management that you always had, expecting the millennials are going to adapt as they grow up. It's not. Their natural characteristics are going to remain the same. So maybe you might like this sort of collaborative, creative environment and think that if I staff my entire company with just millennials, I'm going to have the most collaborative, most creative, forward-thinking group, and it's all going to be great. But I caution you, first of all, because that would be a discriminatory practice. And, you know, human rights may have something to say about that. But also because it's likely that you're going to end up with some skill gaps. If a company is able to harness the skills and the talents of every generation, then they're going to get different perspectives and be that much farther ahead. So if I put things in a different way to sort of better clarify these differences between baby boomers and Gen Xers and the millennials, it would be like this. So if I were to ask you Gen Xers and baby boomers out there how you would describe the look of the environment of your workplace, 9 times out of 10, it's going to look something like this. It's an org structure. It's a hierarchical structure, and this model has been built into our life, into our society, and a lot of companies, most companies. And you might say, you know what, Andrea, this doesn't represent us. We're a lot flatter than that. And, you know, that's fair enough, but I sort of challenge you to think about how much this type of structure is really built into everything in our world today, from our companies to our government, to our schools, even in our sports teams. I mean, I have a friend who was so excited to be voted onto our hockey board as the director of events and marketing or something. And, you know, she was so proud to have that title. So again, it's a hierarchical structure, and a lot of companies think this way because that's the way it's always been. And that's a phrase that I can't stand. That's the way it's always been. But frankly, the org structure mentality was actually created and started in the early 1900s. So that's how long that structure has been around for. So terms like top-down communication and higher-ups and subordinates, and those are all terms born from the org structure. And when you're working in that structure, everyone follows these sort of unwritten rules, right? So, but these millennials, this new generation, they show up and they don't see the world of work like that. They see it in a very different way, and when they show up in your organization, they see the world something like this. They see a network. It's an interconnected web of people and ideas and information. Effectively, it's the internet. And so management gurus like Gary Hamel, they were saying for a while now that the underlying principles on the web of natural hierarchy, transparency, and collaboration, these are the characteristics that will invade management in the coming decades. And it's right. So millennials essentially are a physical manifestation of this network, of the internet, of the web. And they look at your company in the same way. So these are two very different models. And they begin to collide in the workplace, right? I'm sure you've seen it. And neither one's 100% right or 100% wrong. Logic dictates that there's going to be a happy medium here, right? But what I challenge you to do is to see the advantages of both. So if you break it down into smaller pieces, This side has the advantages of compliance and consistency, leadership and decision making, and yet can hold them back in the areas of innovation and collaboration and knowledge sharing across the silos. They thought that great ideas can come from anywhere. That's what happens in the network. So you as a business owner, you may look at this and go and have some anxiety because this is pretty chaotic, isn't it? But that type of thinking, once you start actually processing it and thinking about the differences in those two structures, that's when you're able to start moving forward. So leaders will start to shift from this sort of top-down hierarchical structure where when you're up here, you have a lot less knowledge of what's going on down here in your company, right? And they start to move into sort of the center of the network. And when you're in the center, it's great because you're still driving the vision, you're still giving direction, you still are making decisions, but now you're in the middle of everything. You're seeing what's going on all around you and you're able to talk to everyone and you're accessible to everyone. And that's when the fantastic innovations happen because you've got all these ideas floating around you and in and throughout the web that you didn't have access to before. So as leaders, you want to access those great ideas and unlock them. And you want to change the mindset, get through to people. So that all starts with building the right workplace culture. So how do we define workplace culture? It's things like business values. That's your creativity, your customer satisfaction, safety, your physical environment. Is it collaborative or traditional? Dress code, one of probably the most noticeable physical manifestations of company culture that you'll see today. Leadership, unstructured or structured? And employees, how do they feel about their work? And benefits and perks. How do they help your employees to foster better work-life balance? So how do we talk about capitalizing on the knowledge and the skills and the abilities of these millennials? You know, it's all the rage now to talk about how do we engage these millennials. So in order to attract and retain and ensure that your employees are happy, that's kind of where you start. You provide them with the tools and allow them to be creative and efficient and listen and adapt to how they want to be managed instead of deciding this is how you're going to be managed and you just need to deal with it. So you can either spend all your time trying to figure out how to engage millennials, or you can sort of set things up so that they can do the engaging themselves, because that's how they think nowadays. And the companies that are able to do that effectively are the ones that are going to be thriving over the next 10 years. So now your employer brand, that's what you put out to the face of the world, and your culture is what you sort of focus inward on, and your culture is what you really do with your employees. And hopefully the two work together and they coincide, but if they don't, then you start to have issues with your dissatisfied employees and public scrutiny and decreased credibility with people. If you want to develop your culture, you need to focus on being authentic. So be genuine and support your employees. Know what makes your company unique and exceptional, and then start to build from that. Just because something works for Google or Uber doesn't mean it's going to work for your company. So try and be original. And every company has an identity, good or bad, and change requires strong leadership to make those sorts of changes happen. Employees become disillusioned when the reality doesn't match the story that you're putting out to everybody. And what do we think employees who are disgruntled and disillusioned do when they become upset with the workplace? What do? Pardon? Oh yeah. They go and post it on a blog or a social media page, or, you know, there some sort of ratings site.